You might be wondering how I went from the firstborn, the one destined to inherit it all, to rotting in a jail cell for a crime I didn't commit, while my stepbrother waltzed around, living the life he didn't deserve. If you're curious then, listen close, because this is a story about betrayal, about survival, and about a revenge so sweet that it'll make you question everything you thought you knew about family and loyalty. But before I get into it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Trust me, you don't want to miss a second of what comes next. My name's Sophie, and I was supposed to inherit my father's empire. I was the firstborn, the one who had everything lined up for me. I was groomed to take over, to be the future of our family business. But then, my mother remarried, and everything changed. My father suddenly had a son, and that son, Ryan, was everything he wanted. And because of that one simple thing, Ryan's gender, everything I had worked for was stripped away. Ryan became the heir, not because he earned it, not because he deserved it, but because he was a boy. To my father, that made all the difference. To him, I was nothing more than a placeholder, someone who wasn't worthy of carrying on the legacy just because of what I was born with. And as if that wasn't bad enough, I soon learned that being a woman in my family meant I wasn't just going to be overlooked, I was going to be discarded. If you want to know how I ended up here, you need to understand who Ryan really is, who he always was. He wasn't just a golden child in our family. He was the one who could do no wrong. And that was never more evident than at school. We went to the same private school, and trust me when I say it wasn't a place for the faint-hearted. It was a place where the rich and powerful send their children to learn how to dominate the world. But Ryan was more than just a privileged kid. In that environment, he was a menace. He had this twisted love for power, and the only way he knew how to exercise it was by making others feel weak, small, and powerless. It was in high school that Ryan took bullying to a whole new level. There was this kid, Ethan, a shy, quiet kid who always kept to himself. He wasn't the popular one, the kind of kid who gets picked on for no reason other than just existing. I could tell Ethan didn't fit into Ryan's idea of how people should be, and Ryan took it as an opportunity to break him. It started with small things, Ryan making fun of his clothes, his accent, his appearance, but it didn't stop there. One afternoon, after school, Ryan decided he was going to teach Ethan a lesson. I'll never forget that day. It was a Wednesday, a crisp autumn afternoon, and we were leaving school early. Ryan had somehow convinced a group of his friends, his little entourage, to follow him, to watch him make an example of someone. Ethan was walking home alone, and I saw Ryan from a distance. He was waiting for him at the edge of the schoolyard. It wasn't a coincidence. Ryan knew exactly where Ethan was going to be. It was all planned out. Ryan walked up to him, his face full of that cocky, arrogant grin he always wore, and then he did something that still haunts me. Ryan shoved Ethan hard. Ethan stumbled, his feet catching the edge of the curb. I could hear the sound of his head hitting the pavement. It was a sickening thud that still echoes in my mind. He fell to the ground like a rag doll, and for a second, no one moved. Ethan didn't get up. He didn't even twitch. And when I ran over, panic sinking in, I could tell something was wrong, something was terribly wrong. He pushed Ethan so hard that his head hit the concrete just the right way, leaving him unconscious, bleeding, and with severe trauma to his spine. That fall didn't just knock him out. It sent him into a coma. Ethan was paralyzed from the neck down. His life was ruined, all because of Ryan's sick obsession with bullying the weakest kid he could find. It wasn't just a prank. It wasn't just boys being boys. Ryan destroyed someone's life that day, and I knew, deep down, that he'd never face the consequences for it. Why? Because Ryan was untouchable. But the worst part was when the truth came out. Ethan's condition was serious. The doctors weren't sure if he'd ever wake up, let alone walk again. And that's when Ryan did something even worse than the crime itself. Ryan knew he was going to get away with it. He always did. But his ego was so inflated that he thought he could turn this whole thing around and make me the villain. He manipulated the situation, twisted the facts, and turned it all against me. He spread lies that I had been the one to push Ethan, that I had done it out of jealousy or spite. He knew I'd never be able to defend myself, that my word wouldn't mean anything against his. And the worst part, our father, that man who should have protected me, sided with Ryan. He cut ties with me, disowned me, and said I wasn't his daughter anymore. Can you believe that? My own father, the one person I thought I could trust, told me I was nothing. He stood by Ryan, ignored the truth, and blamed me for everything. He said I was a disgrace. And just like that, I became the scapegoat for Ryan's evil. I went from being the firstborn heir to a criminal in the blink of an eye. The next thing I knew, I was arrested, framed for something I didn't do. I spent years in prison, with no one to back me up, no one to fight for me. My father didn't care. Ryan? He went on with his life, completely untouched. I thought maybe, just maybe, there was a chance the truth would come out. I thought maybe the trial would go in my favor. But as it turns out, the truth doesn't always matter when the right people are backing the lies. You see, the thing that really sealed my fate was that I had been seen with Ethan, walking home from school together, on several occasions. I wasn't a complete stranger to him. He wasn't just some random kid I barely knew. I talked to him, helped him with his homework, even walked home with him a few times. I wasn't popular at school, but I always tried to be kind to people who were overlooked, like Ethan. I guess I should have known that being seen with someone like him would come back to bite me. On that fateful day when Ryan decided to make his move, I wasn't even there at first. I had gone back to the library to grab a book I needed for a project. I remember I was just trying to get in and out quickly. Nothing unusual. But when I came out of the library, that's when I saw it. I saw Ryan pushing Ethan. I saw Ethan fall. I didn't know the extent of what had happened at first. I didn't know that Ethan would be paralyzed, sent into a coma, and lose his life, as he knew it. But it was already too late. By the time I rushed over, students had already witnessed the event. Some of them were in Ryan's group of friends. Some were just bystanders who were too afraid to do anything. But the key point was, they all saw me. They saw me standing there, and they all testified in court that I was there when it happened. I couldn't believe it. No one would listen to me. No one would believe me when I said I didn't push Ethan, that I wasn't involved in whatever Ryan had planned. I had already been branded as guilty because I was the one closest to him, the one who had been seen with him on multiple occasions. My connection to Ethan was twisted into something it wasn't. I wasn't his attacker, but I was painted as his accomplice, someone who'd been part of a larger plot that no one understood. The fact that I had been seen with Ethan made the case worse for me. No one cared to look deeper into the situation. They didn't look at Ryan's history, at how he had always been cruel to those who were weaker. They didn't care that Ryan was the one who caused all of this, that it was his push that sent Ethan into a coma. They only cared that I was there, that I was somehow connected, and that I was an easy scapegoat. I remember sitting in that courtroom, listening to the testimonies, watching the jury and the judge nodding as if they already knew what the outcome would be. They didn't care that I was just a kid, that I didn't deserve to be locked up in a cell. They didn't care about anything except the story they had already convinced themselves was true. And my father, he didn't even show up. Not once. Not when I needed him. He had already made his decision long before the trial started. And Ryan? He didn't even look back at me. He was too busy playing the role of the innocent, perfect son. My mother, my sweet mother, did everything she could. She was devastated, crying her eyes out in the courtroom, begging the judge to see reason, to understand that her daughter wasn't capable of what they accused her of. But it didn't matter. Not to them. They were too blinded by the narrative Ryan and my father had woven. They didn't care that I was 13, that I was just a child who had been caught up in something far bigger than me. They sentenced me to 20 years in a juvenile prison, as if I had been the one who destroyed Ethan's life. It didn't matter that I had never intended for any of this to happen. I was just a kid caught in the crossfire of a game that wasn't mine to play, and I was punished for it. When they took me away in handcuffs, I couldn't even look at my mother. She was broken, shattered, helpless. I could hear her cries echoing as they closed the door to the courtroom. I knew she was losing her daughter, and I felt like I was losing everything. I was so young. I didn't know what the next 20 years would bring, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to stay silent. Those first few years in prison, they were hell. absolute hell. But that's when I realized something crucial, that I couldn't just sit there and let them destroy me. I wasn't going to waste the only opportunity I had left to prove to myself and to the world that I wasn't a victim. I had to be stronger. I had to be smarter. If they thought they could lock me up and forget about me, they were in for a rude awakening. At first, I was just a scared, angry girl thrown into a system that didn't care about me. The guards, the other inmates, they all saw me as just another criminal. I was treated like the trash they thought I was. But I knew I had one thing going for me: time. I had all the time in the world to plan. So, that's exactly what I did. I spent every waking moment thinking, studying, and learning. I started reading everything I could get my hands on: books on business, on law, on human psychology, anything that would give me an edge. It wasn't enough to just sit there and feel sorry for myself. I knew if I ever got out of here, I had to be ready. I made connections too. Prison is a weird place. People come and go, and while most would assume that the environment only breeds violence and despair, it also breeds opportunity. I found people who were willing to help me learn things I didn't know, people who had skills that could teach me how to be more than just a survivor. At 23, I finally walked out of that prison, but it wasn't the same girl who had walked in. At 13, the years in that hellhole had aged me, hardened me, turned me into someone I didn't even recognize at first. But the person I had become, she was exactly who I needed to be. I had spent the last 10 years obsessing over one thing, making them pay. But I was no longer just driven by anger. I was driven by something much more powerful: strategy. I had learned how to survive, how to read people, how to make connections in places where no one even knew I existed. I had been in a place where I had nothing. My release didn't come easy. It wasn't some miracle or a grand gesture. It wasn't a case of the truth finally coming out. I wish it had been that simple. No, my release came through a legal loophole, a technicality in the way my case had been handled. Over the years, I had studied the law relentlessly, picking apart the smallest details of my case, learning everything I could to find a way out. When my lawyer found that flaw in the evidence, we presented it, and the court, after years of ignoring me, had no choice but to let me go. But even then, when I was finally free, I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. Instead, all I could think about was what I was going to do next. I wasn't free just to be free. I was free to take what was rightfully mine. And that was only the beginning. I spent my first few months outside trying to regain a sense of what it meant to be normal. The world had changed so much in the time I was locked away: technology, trends, everything. But I was a fast learner, and I wasn't about to let the world pass me by. I dove straight into the business world. Starting from scratch wasn't easy. When I first stepped out of prison, I had nothing but the clothes on my back, a small savings I'd managed to scrape together during my time behind bars, and a burning desire to prove that I could make something of myself, no matter how little I had. I wasn't naive enough to think that success would come overnight. At first, I took on small jobs. Nothing glamorous, just enough to survive. I worked for a few companies here and there, doing anything I could to pay the bills. But I knew I wasn't meant to be just another cog in the machine. I wasn't going to settle for someone else's success. I had bigger plans. I made a deal with a few former inmates, people who knew the value of second chances. They had connections, resources that I could use to get my foot in the door of the business world. I didn't have money, but I had something more valuable: knowledge and the hunger to succeed. So, I used that. I worked my way up, one deal at a time, building a network of people who respected my ambition and my work ethic. They didn't care about my past. All they cared about was what I could do for them. It wasn't long before I had my first legitimate business venture. It wasn't much at first, just a small tech startup that was struggling to get off the ground. But it was a start, and I knew how to make the most of it. I brought in investors, connected with the right people, and used everything I had learned about management and negotiation to turn the company around. It wasn't easy. There were nights I barely slept, days when it felt like nothing was going my way, but I pushed through. My small startup grew, slowly at first, but then, all at once, I learned how to position my company in ways no one expected. I was an outsider, someone who had been locked away for years, But that was my advantage. I wasn't tied to the old networks or the old ways of doing business. I brought fresh ideas, a new perspective, and it caught the attention of investors. I grew the company, expanded into different sectors, and started acquiring other businesses, small, struggling ones that I could turn into successful ventures. I wasn't just building something for myself. I was building a legacy, a foundation that would allow me to take on the giants of the business world, the same people who had once written me off. 10 years passed. My reputation began to spread. People in the business world started to take notice. I became a force to be reckoned with, not just because of my ambition, but because of the results I was delivering. I wasn't just about flashy presentations or empty promises. I delivered. I turned companies around. I made money, and the more success I had, the more people wanted to work with me. I became a symbol of what could be achieved when you refused to give up, when you took everything that had been taken from you and turned it into something more powerful. When I first heard the news about the family business, I wasn't surprised. Ryan, always so cocky and full of himself, had never been the kind of person who understood the real value of what he was entrusted with. He was the heir, but only by default. He never earned it, and when I was locked away, he was left to run the company. But I had no idea how bad things had gotten. I had cut off all ties with my father and Ryan years ago. I didn't want their pity or their empty gestures. I didn't want their approval. I had moved on. I had my own empire to focus on now. But when I started to hear rumors, I knew something was wrong. Ryan was gambling away company funds, hitting casinos and high-stakes poker games, convinced he could win his way out of the mess he was making. He wasn't just reckless with the company's money, he was out of control. His personal life was just as chaotic. He had a string of affairs, women coming in and out of his life like disposable toys. He didn't care about the company. He didn't care about anything except satisfying his own ego and indulgences. But our father, ever the enabler, kept covering for him. Despite the mounting problems, he didn't want to admit to anyone that Ryan was ruining everything. Instead, he kept cleaning up Ryan's messes, patching up holes and putting out fires that Ryan kept starting. But in doing so, he just let the company sink deeper into the ground. I didn't know the full extent of it, though. Not right away. What I didn't know at the time was that our father had been very sick, terminally sick. Colon cancer at its worst. I didn't find out until much later, and by then, it didn't matter. He had made sure to keep me in the dark, just as he'd always planned. He didn't want me to be a part of any of it. To him, I was already dead. He'd written me off completely. He had pushed me aside when I was younger, and now, even in his final days, he refused to acknowledge me. I had no way of knowing that while I was building my own empire, the foundation of the family business was crumbling. By the time our father's health had deteriorated, the company was barely afloat. The employees were frustrated, the investors were withdrawing, and Ryan had no idea how to fix any of it. But he didn't care. He was too busy with his parties, his gambling, and whatever woman he was chasing that week. The company was just another toy to him, a tool to stroke his own ego, not something that needed real work or attention. Ryan's biggest weakness was his ego. He thought he could outsmart anyone, that he could gamble his way to victory, even if it meant throwing away everything his father had worked for. And I knew exactly how to exploit it. See, I had always known where Ryan went when he wanted to escape the reality of running a failing business. I knew the underground gambling den where he would go to try and make up for his endless losses. It was his little sanctuary, a place where he felt like a king again, even though he was nothing but a fool with too much money and too little sense. And when I found out that Ryan was planning to meet with a well-known tycoon in the business world, someone who had a reputation for taking risky bets, I knew this was the perfect opportunity. The man he was meeting was someone I had been tracking for a while. His name was Vincent Delacroix, a ruthless business tycoon known for his cutthroat nature and ability to take control of failing companies. He had built an empire on the backs of smaller businesses, and Ryan, blinded by his need to prove himself, thought he could outsmart him in a high-stakes game. Ryan was desperate to get back the money he'd lost, and Vincent knew exactly how to bait him. He promised Ryan that if he could win the game, he'd give him full ownership of a profitable part of his empire, while Ryan would give him full ownership to the business our father had built over the years. They struck a deal and even signed documents for legal purposes. Ryan, with his usual arrogance, thought he could win it all. He saw the game as his final chance to redeem himself, to keep the family business from falling apart. But I knew better. I sent one of my trusted representatives, a man who had connections with the high society Ryan still thought he was a part of. His name was John Cartwright, and he was as sharp as they came. John had made a name for himself in the business world, working with rivals and under-the-table deals that most would consider unsavory. He was exactly the kind of person who could blend into Ryan's world and watch without ever being noticed. John was instructed to show up at the gambling den and make sure Ryan's promise was set in stone. He was to ensure that Ryan, in his drunken arrogance, would sign away full ownership of the company, in the hopes of securing his win in this ridiculous game. I knew Vincent Delacroix wasn't the kind of man to honor a bet like that, especially when Ryan was so easily manipulated. All it took was a few strategically placed words from John, enough to get Ryan to agree to a stupid bet he would regret. Ryan promised everything, full ownership of the family business, just to win a stupid game of chance. He lost everything. Vincent, as I had anticipated, won the game fair and square. But instead of honoring his promise, Vincent did what Vincent always did. He took Ryan's offer as a joke, and when the game ended, he didn't hand over anything. He left Ryan standing there, humiliated, with nothing. Not only did Ryan lose, but he had promised ownership of the company he couldn't back out of. Everything fell into place faster than I had expected. Thanks to my connections and the strategic moves I had been making behind the scenes, I was able to arrange a meeting with Vincent Delacroix. He was a businessman, ruthless in his ways, but not someone who would hesitate to make a deal if it served his interests. My representative, John Cartwright, had kept Vincent in the loop about the chaos Ryan had caused, and I knew Vincent was ready to sell the company. It didn't matter to him who owned it, as long as he walked away with something substantial. So, when I made my offer, he took it, just like that, without hesitation. The company that Ryan had been clinging to, the company that had once been promised to him, was now mine. Ryan, in his usual ignorance, had no idea that Vincent had agreed to the sale. He tried his best to keep the news from our father, knowing how critical his health was. Our father had been slowly dying from colon cancer for months, barely able to stay conscious, and Ryan wanted to shield him from the truth. But there was one more thing I had to do before I could truly claim what was rightfully mine. I needed to confront my father. He had betrayed me, written me off when I was a child, and abandoned me to rot in prison. He had allowed Ryan to destroy everything, and in the end, he had refused to even acknowledge my existence. I walked into that hospital room where my father lay, his body ravaged by cancer, barely recognizable from the man he once was. The sterile smell of the hospital filled the room, and the soft beeping of the machines keeping him alive was the only sound. I stood there for a moment, just watching him, trying to steady myself. All those years of anger, betrayal, and pain flooded back in an instant. But I wasn't here for him to make it right. No, this moment was for me. I had made it, and he would have to face me. Face what he had done to me. Face the daughter he had rejected. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, standing beside his bed. His eyes, once full of power and arrogance, were now hollow, weak. He could barely lift his head, and his breathing was shallow. But when he saw me, when his eyes locked with mine, I could see a flicker of recognition. With my voice steady but firm, I introduced myself to him in a way he could never have anticipated. "I'm Sophie," I said, "the daughter you threw away, the one you sent to prison for something I didn't do. I'm the one who owns the company you denied me all those years ago, the company that you let your son destroy." He couldn't speak. He didn't have the strength to say anything. He could only stare at me, tears streaming from his eyes. I saw them, those tears, and for the first time, I felt a pang of something deep inside me. Was it sympathy? Was it regret? I couldn't tell. I didn't want to know. I cried. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. The weight of everything I had been through, the betrayal, the injustice, the years in prison, all of it came flooding out. And then, I did what I had to do. I turned and left that room, leaving him with nothing but his regrets. I didn't need his approval anymore. I had everything I needed. I had built an empire from the ground up. And now, it was no longer his. It was mine. And there was nothing anyone could do to stop me.